So hello everyone, we are in for this week's video, for the third video of the month of August. So for this week's video, we're going to cover a topic that is a little further back than what we typically cover here on the channel. I'd like to start covering more older topics, so this kind of fits into that thing. And today we're going to go fast, we're going to rewind the clock back to 1066. So this is like right in the middle of the Middle Ages. This is the Middle Ages galore. And what we're going, if anyone has an idea of what probably is the biggest event on the globe in 1066, it is the Norman invasion of England and the Battle of Hastings, which dramatically changes the history of England and changes the trajectory of the British Isles through the Norman conquest of 1066. So that is what we're going to cover today. So we're going to go through here a little bit of the background of how we get up to 1066 in this point, because there's a whole bunch of there's two main groups here at play with the Norman invasion, and that, of course, is the native Anglo-Saxons, who had been on the island for many centuries at this point, and have been ruling it on their own, and then you have the Normans, who come from northern France and Normandy, and they come in and invade for certain reasons. But we'll get to that here momentarily. So first, let's take a look at the Anglo-Saxons and a little bit of their history. Now, the Anglo-Saxons were not the original inhabitants of England or the British Isles. Originally, that would have been the Britons, who were a Celtic people, and today their descendants would be the Welsh. The Welsh are descended from the Britons, who still managed to remain on the actual island of England. You also had them being related to the Celtic Picts up north, which eventually becomes Scotland, and then, of course, the Gaels across the water, who would become the Irish, and most particularly. But in not 1066, but at the very end of the 4th and 5th century, so about the 300s, 400s AD, this is when England experiences its first dramatic shift, because it is at this time that the Western Roman Empire is starting to collapse, it's starting to decline, and part of that reason is because it cannot maintain its massive border against all these invading peoples that are now moving in and migrating into Europe and migrating and living and staking claims out wherever they want. And the Western Roman Empire does not have the resources nor the manpower to really defend such a large border as it has. And eventually, they decide, we're going to abandon England. We cannot maintain our hold in England. It's going to have to be abandoned. So the Western Roman Empire pulls out of Britain that had been under Roman rule since Julius Caesar, roughly 300 to 400 years before, ever since his conquest of Britain. And upon them leaving, the native Brittonic people are now left to their own devices, and this leaves them wide open to three invading groups that come across the North Sea from the area of Denmark and northern Germany, what is now those countries. And that would be three distinct Germanic peoples that come across and invade England and start establishing communities and homes there. You have the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. And the Jutes were a little bit on the outlier part. They were not so much as... They did intermingle, but they're kind of the outlier in this thing, because the Anglo-Saxons, of course, is the gradual... Eventually, the Angles and the Saxons kind of became so intertwined with each other, they merged into a single people, eventually. That became the Anglo-Saxons. And the Anglo-Saxons would conquer most of what is now England and part of Scotland, and would eventually form their own kingdoms in now Anglo-Saxon England, because now we're past the Roman period, and they become England's new masters of the British Isles, is the Anglo-Saxons. And this would eventually come about over the next couple hundred years after the conquest. So after about the 400s AD, this slowly comes about through the Dark Ages. And eventually what happens is the Anglo-Saxons form four separate kingdoms in what is now England. And the four Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that were the major kingdoms at that time were East Anglia, Northumbria, Mercia, and Wessex. And Mercia, for the longest time, had been the most powerful of them. Unfortunately, everything changed again when the Vikings started coming in about the 800s AD. And when the Vikings start arriving in England in the 9th century, it starts to weaken several of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Many of them have coastlines and can't really repel these foreign invaders that ironically also come from the area. Many of them do come from Denmark, where their ancestors had originally been from. And when this happens, it kind of puts them at a disadvantage because they're now faced with an enemy that is destabilizing their countries, their kingdoms, and they have rivalries with each other to boot. And what comes out of the Viking invasions is a weakened Anglo-Saxon England. Except for one particular kingdom. There is one kingdom that manages to kind of withstand and hold itself together during the Viking invasions, and that is the Kingdom of Wessex. And Wessex eventually is ruled by the Anglo-Saxon king Alfred, Alfred the Great, as many would call him. And Alfred is partly got his title of the Great because he is king of Wessex, and he manages in about 886, 887, he manages to unite all of the remaining Anglo-Saxon kingdoms into a kingdom of the Anglo-Saxons. So now there's no Mercia, there's no East Anglia, there's no Northumbria. They're all under Wessex control, or at least most of them are. Eventually, it would take two of his successors to formally get the rest of England fully under their control. But eventually, what come about was a reformation about two of the name, eventually 2 kings down, where Ethelstan proclaimed that it was now no longer the kingdom of the Anglo-Saxons, it was now the kingdom of England, which is where England eventually comes about as a nation for the first time. Now, England would continue to suffer Viking invasions over the next 150 years, and in fact, for a time between about 1016 and 1042, England was ruled by a Danish king that had managed to get a hold of the throne. Eventually, in 1042, the Danish king passed away. His successor did not rule very long. And Edward the Confessor takes the throne. He is the son of the last Anglo-Saxon ruler, and he ends up taking the throne as now the King of England. So finally, the monarchy is back in Anglo-Saxon hands. Now, Edward the Confessor was somewhat of an oddball because although he was married, he never had any children. He would end up dying a childless man. Now, and this is where it gets odd, where because Edward didn't have any children, he also didn't have a very clear heir as to who would succeed him upon his death. And Edward would kind of use that as a diplomatic tool to get his way when arranging things with other leaders or foreign enemies, and by promising them to some degree that, oh yeah, you have a claim to my throne when I pass. Basically promising the throne to people, and many people, that he could not keep, but nor did probably Edward care, because he just knew that he wasn't going to be around when that happened, because the only reason they would need the throne is because he'd be dead. So Edward, during his lifetime, uses the fact that he is a childless king that does not have any children as kind of this diplomatic tool to use when negotiating with people by promising different people the right to England's throne upon his death, which would end up coming to massively backfire against the Anglo-Saxons. And among the claimants that Edward supposedly made promises to as to who would become king upon his death were Harold Godwinson, who was his brother-in-law, who was the brother of his wife, and Harold's other brother, Tostig, also supposedly had a claim to the throne. There's also reports that Harold III of Norway was also promised a throne at one point, probably partly due to the previous Viking rulers. And then William, Duke of Normandy, was also promised at one point the throne of England during Edward's long reign. And in particular, it is going to be William that is going to become William and Harold Godwinson are going to be the main 2 characters in this event, because they are the ones that are really going to duke it out over what goes on after Edward's death. Now, William is the Duke of Normandy. He is the leader of the Normans. And where do the Normans come from? Well, the Normans are not Anglo-Saxons. The Normans are actually descendants of Viking invaders who had landed in northern France centuries before. And in the year 911, so way before 1066, in 911, King Charles of France had actually granted the Norman leader Rollo a tract of land on France's northern coast to be called Normandy as a permanent home for the Normans, that they would not interfere in France's affairs that much if they agreed to pay, homage to the king and everything else. Then the king would allow them to have their own tract of land within the kingdom. And Rollo accepted this, and this became the Normans' home, and thus the region bore their name, Normandy, which is probably much more known for the D-Day invasions of World War II. But after the Normans got this tract of land in northern France, they eventually would assimilate to a large degree into French culture. They would adopt Christianity and move away from paganism during their assimilation, and they also began to speak French instead of their original Scandinavian languages. However, as kind of a callback to their Viking heritage, the Normans were still very much a warrior-like culture. They were a warrior-like people, much like their Viking forebears, and that was not something that really went away. And they were among the best soldiers in Europe at the time. Now, William, by the time of Edward's coming to the end of his reign, William is now Duke of Normandy. He is now the leader of the Normans, and he is supposedly got a claim to the throne. Well, that's going to come in conflict here very shortly with Harold Godwinson, who is the king's brother-in-law, who also has a claim to the throne that perhaps could be stronger. So, Edward, what eventually happens to kickstart the Norman invasion of England in 1066 was, of course, Edward's death. Edward died on January 5th of 1066, leaving no clear heir since he had no children. Now, supposedly on his deathbed, Edward had confessed that he wanted Harold to be his heir, that he designated Harold to be his successor. Now, whether or not that is true, we do not know. All we do know is that the Anglo-Saxon Witan, or the Parliament, did decide that Harold would be Edward's successor over anyone else. So they chose Harold Godwinson, since he seemingly had the strongest claim to the throne and was more related to the king, that, okay, you are going to be the successor to Edward. So the very next day after Edward's death, they ended up crowning Harold Godwinson in Winchester. I can't remember, not Winchester, but Westminster. In Westminster Chapel, the same place where they have him now. Westminster Abbey, I think, is what they call it. But it would technically be the first coronation to ever happen at Westminster that has ever occurred. But Harold, it becomes king upon Edward's death. Harold Godwinson does. And immediately after being crowned, Harold is faced with enemies. He's faced with rivals that are furious that he has now inherited the kingship, because Edward had confessed during his lifetime that these men were also promised the same throne that Harold has now gotten, and they feel that they have been cheated. William, the Duke of Normandy, William opposed Harold's ascension specifically on the grounds that he claimed that Harold had actually sworn an oath to him 2 years prior in 1064 in his presence that he would defend William's right to the throne upon Edward's death. So William's coming at Harold and saying, how dare you accept the throne of England, because you were in front of me 2 years ago, swore in front of me in my very presence that you would defend my right and claim to the throne upon Edward's death, and here you go and accept it for yourself. Whether or not that is true is still up for debate, but that was William's reasoning, partly on why he was so irate. He viewed it partly, very largely, as a betrayal of Harold against him, because before that, Harold had actually been received well by William when he had gone and visited Normandy years earlier, and now William sees it as a betrayal of somebody who he thought was on his side and is now claiming this throne. Whether or not he had ever been promised it is another matter. Harold's brother Tostig ended up coming out of exile after his brother ascended the throne in order to raid the southern and eastern coast of England in May, before he decided that he also wanted to pursue his claim to the throne by joining forces with King Harold III of Norway, who was already prepping for an invasion of England due to Harold ascending the throne. Now, Harold would end up keeping his militia on guard all summer long, but eventually had to dismiss it in early September when it ran out of supplies and the harvest season approached. So Harold comes into power. He already is faced with all these people saying, you should not be king. I am the rightful king. You are not the one that should have the throne. So Harold, rightfully so, guesses, I probably need to up my militia in case there's an invasion, or in case somebody tries to get a little gun happy here. Not a little gun happy, but a little war happy, and tries to forcibly take my crown from me. So I'm going to up the defenses of England, anticipating there'll be an invasion. And all summer, Harold and his militia wait, anticipating that war is coming with somebody, and only for it not to materialize before the harvest season has come, which then forces Harold to dismiss many of the militia so they can go home and help out with the family harvest, which leaves, in particular, the southern coast vulnerable to invasion, which is going to prompt William to make his move. Now, in September, an invasion did end up coming. But Harold III of Norway and Harold Godwinson's brother Tostig ended up invading in the north at Yorkshire. in an attempt to dislodge Harold from the throne and claim it for themselves. At the Battle of Stamford Bridge on September 25th, Harold's forces would actually defeat that invasion pretty easily, with both Harold III and Tostig being killed during that battle, and neither of them surviving. So that ends the challenge from Norway and from his own brother. But while that has solved the challenge from his own brother and from the King of Norway, it still leaves one contender, William. And William is perhaps the biggest threat because William is the Duke of Normandy. He's right across the channel. He could possibly get the backing of the French crown in order to go after Harold. And at the same time, the Normans are a warrior people. They are very warlike in nature and thus prepared for a conflict at almost any time. And Harold at the time, because this invasion kind of sets as a setback because William ends up arriving in England right after this battle against his brother and against the King of Norway. So Harold is up north, and here William comes from the south, and he don't really have time to let his army rest and replenish before he goes at William. And that is eventually what's going to happen here. And William had spent August of 1066. He saw an opportunity immediately that he could, with Harold having withdrawn the militia from southern England, William sees an opportunity to launch a massive invasion. He also knows that the King of Norway is also launching his own invasion to the north, and knows that Harold's forces will be distracted taking them out to the north. So he sees a perfect opportunity to launch an invasion force that will land on the southern shore of England in order for him to try to claim the throne for himself. So William spends all of August of 1066 trying to get and secure that support from both the Norman aristocracy and the Catholic Church for an invasion of England in August, arguing that it was needed because basically Harold's a liar. Harold is an oath breaker. He's not fit to be king. I kind of find it funny that William managed to get the permission of the Catholic Pope. That he managed to get the permission of the Pope to ordain this invasion, even though later on the Pope kind of rescinded William and said, "You've killed too many people during this battle. You need to do something for repentance." And while he is gathering the support in August of 1066, William manages to muster a force of about 4,000 to 7,000 armored Norman knights. And they are going to be his major invasion force. The Norman Knights were one of the most feared military units on the continent at that time. However, bad winds across the English Channel ended up delaying his invasion by over 8 weeks. So, although William is ready by the end of August to really go out there and go after Harold, he can't because he cannot safely get his forces across the channel due to the weather. And the weather doesn't clear up until, ironically, 2 days after the Battle of Stamford Bridge up in northern England. So 2 days after this battle in which King Harold of Norway and Harold Godwinson's brother Tostig are killed in their invasion to try to get rid of Harold from the throne of England, just 2 days after that battle, the winds give up to the south, and William is finally able to sail his massive invasion fleet across the English Channel on September 27th. And their forces would cross it, and they land in the town of Pevensey on September 28th, and then move to the nearby town of Hastings in order to wait out Harold's forces. And just to try to entice Harold to come down quicker to meet him, William instructs that the invading Normans start burning and looting any small towns and villages they can go through to try to get Harold's attention, to get them to say, "Hey, I'm here. You're not going to wait. I want to go at this right now." Basically, denying Harold that opportunity to replenish his forces and let them rest, because he no sooner has won one battle and he hears he's got another invasion force to his south that he now has to deal with. So Harold, in response, hurries south with over 7,000 men and arrives outside Hastings on the night of October 13th. And the sun went down. What a lot of people misunderstand with Hastings is Hastings did not really occur largely in broad daylight. In fact, it occurred more toward the evening the very next day. And the sun went down rather early that day as well. So a lot of this fighting actually happened more at twilight or kind of darkness. It was not exactly like bright high noon day with broad, sunlight everywhere. It was kind of at times confusing over who you were shooting at or who you were fighting because of the fact that it was getting near nighttime by the time this commenced. And Harold rushes south with his own 7,000 men by October 13th, and he is surprised that William has set up in Hastings as he has. And in response, he takes his 7,000 men and draws them up along a high ridge outside of Hastings, about 10 miles to the northwest, in order to kind of hold the high ground of the battlefield. That infamous little Star Wars meme, if anyone's familiar with it. I have the high ground, you can't beat me. Well, this same concept is trying to be held here, because he also knows the Normans have mounted knights. I don't have mounted knights. Our Anglo-Saxon infantry are foot soldiers. They are not going to do well against mounted cavalry unless they have the high position. And Harold puts them on this ridge in the hopes that that will be enough to counter the mounted knights. And it is at the start of the battle. So that leads us to October 14th, with the Battle of Hastings actually breaking out. Harold's infantry would initially hold very firm against the repeated attacks by the mounted Norman cavalry knights. Well, mounted Norman knights, as we'll call them. The Normans, on the one hand, they failed on the initial attack against the Anglo-Saxon forces, and at first it looked as though Harold would win because of this fact that the Normans failed to breach the English lines, and then there circulated a rumor on the battlefield that William had actually been killed, and the Normans, many of them, started to panic and start retreating because they thought William's dead. There's no point in continuing this. Our leader's dead. We're trapped. And that was not the case, but that rumor alone was enough to blunt the first initial couple assaults that the Normans tried against the Anglo-Saxon forces. William eventually had to take off his helmet in order to show his troops that he was yet alive, that he was not dead, and then proceeded to rally them for a counterattack to turn around and slam back into their defenses and take them out. I'm alive. I'm not dead. We've not lost this battle yet. And they turn around and half retreat. The Normans turn right back around and hit the English forces again repeatedly. And this repetitive, clashing ends up gradually over time. It ends up gradually wearing the English Anglo-Saxon forces down. And eventually what happens is all the English forces end up retreating after Harold ends up getting killed in the battle. Harold actually, legend says that Harold was killed, and it is depicted on the Bayeux Tapestry, that Harold was supposedly killed by an arrow to the eye. And this ended up killing him. Either way, Harold did die during the battle. His body was identified later on by the Normans for retrieval. And after Harold ends up being killed, the English forces, in panic disarray, retreat from the battlefield late on October 14th. Now, William decided to then advance and isolate London after taking the field at Hastings, in order to kind of isolate London, because London is one of the second most powerful city in England at that point. The capital is at Winchester, but London is the main headquarters. And London is also where I believe it's where Westminster Abbey is, I think. Pretty sure. I could be wrong on that. I probably am wrong on that, honestly, but London is still an important city to the Anglo-Saxons, and William very much realizes, yes, it is in London. So Westminster Abbey is there. That's where the kings are starting to be crowned, and William kind of also realizes the government is still there, probably waiting word from Harold. I could isolate the city and cut them off and decapitate the Anglo-Saxon government in one move. And this is exactly what he does. He proceeds to advance on it and isolate it, and the major English leaders who were within London decide to surrender to him at Berkhamsted very soon after. William was eventually crowned King of England on Christmas Day of 1066, meaning that Harold's death at the Battle of Hastings had ended up marking basically the end of Anglo-Saxon rule of England, because now, with William now as king, you're now faced with the predicament that it is no longer the Anglo-Saxons who are ruling you, it is now the Normans. The Normans are now the rulers of the Anglo-Saxons. So what immediately happens after there's a couple of major changes that come with the Norman conquest of England. In particular, William's conquest, as we just mentioned, it is the end of Anglo-Saxon rule, because now all the nobles and aristocracy and the monarchy are going to be Norman dominated. Eventually, one of William's sons would marry a descendant of the House of Wessex, someone that was in the family, which would reintroduce the old Anglo-Saxon bloodline into the royal family. So meaning that, like, for example, modern-day King Charles is both a descendant of William the Conqueror through his Norman lineage, but at the same time, he is also a descendant of Alfred the Great of the House of Wessex and Edward the Confessor through that marriage that had happened with King Henry I and Matilda of Scotland. But immediately after the Norman conquest, you're going to see, most profoundly probably, the difference in language. The Anglo-Saxons speak Old English, which is different from modern English, but they speak an old dialect of the basis of modern English language, while the Normans, since they come from northern France and have kind of assimilated there, they don't speak Old English. They speak Norman French, their own dialect of the language. And there's a very big difference between those two, because if you go to the royal courts, the palaces, and the nobles or the king, you're going to hear more of the language of Norman French, but if you go to the commoners, they're going to continue to speak Old English, which is very different from their rulers. Eventually, the two languages over the next 3 centuries would start to merge into what we call Middle English, which would be kind of a state of in the middle, in between both of these two languages, where they're starting to merge together into one language. Because at this point, the Norman identities are becoming part of the English ones. And eventually, Middle English would then further evolve into modern English that we have today. And part of that is the two differences in languages is also why, in particular, one example that you can see in modern English of the Norman influence and the Anglo-Saxon one is how we refer to the meat that comes from different animals for existence. For example, in English, we call it a cow, and that comes from the old Anglo-Saxon word of co, which then we have, however, we don't call a cow's meat cow meat, we call it beef, which comes from the French boeuf, which was from the Normans. The same thing with chicken, which was the Anglo-Saxon term, but then we call it poultry after poultre, which could come from the French. So the difference in how we call different meats of different animals in particular is one particular lasting influence of the difference between the Normans and the Anglo-Saxons, and just our language for existence. There's other differences too, but just our language, it's kind of interesting to see that that's where that actually comes from. Now, the indigenous Anglo-Saxons would continue revolting against Norman rule. Just because Harold died and because William got proclaimed king doesn't mean that they gave up entirely. There were many pockets of resistance that still did not believe that William was the legitimate king, that William had, he had deposed Harold, he had killed Harold, that didn't make him legitimate. We're not going to accept him as king, and there's many rebellions that break out against Norman rule in England as a consequence of that, up until about 1071. And William would actually help out with personally suppressing more than one of these rebellions, most brutally, in order to basically make sure that the people were not going to rise up again. The one that William had a direct hand in, I believe, was the one in Northumbria at about 1070. And as a way to kind of solidify Norman rule and enforce Norman rule in England and also in Normandy as well, William would build a large amount of castles in order to enforce it and act as strongholds for his military. And that is where the whole concept of castle building in England really gets its start. Not to say that the Anglo-Saxons didn't have a couple, but the Normans really bring in the castle building to England as a means of enforcing their rule on the English people. William would also commission the Domesday Book that would record the population of all in England and take basically information on every single province under Norman rule. And they would also introduce the feudal system from continental Europe to England that had already been introduced there, but is the dominant form of hierarchical society that is dominant in the European Middle Ages, with the king being on the very top of the pyramid, and then down the row we have the nobles, then the knights below them, and then the merchants and the farmers, and at the very bottom you have the peasants / the serfs who work for a lord. And the Norman conquest of England is very much, it changes in a way it very much changes the outlook of England as a whole, because before the Norman conquest, England is not really militaristic. England is not very outgoing. It kind of keeps to itself. And after the Norman conquest, this mixing of these two cultures and the warlikeness of the Normans, I think, brought a different attitude to the Kingdom of England, one that had not been seen before, because it's very shortly after that, about 100 years down the road, that they get involved in the Crusades. And then they also have the whole wars with France, which can also stem from this conflict, because, as we know, England and France have long gone at it. The Hundred Years' War, for instance, was fought over the factor that the English kings claimed that they were the legitimate heirs to the throne of France. And part of the reason that they even held this claim was because of William. William had been had been the leader of the Normans. The Normans were originally from France, and thus, as a vassal of the French state, had some claim to the French throne in some capacity. So since they're descendants of the Normans who had then taken over England, the English kings, to a certain degree, did have some level of claim to the French throne. It was not as much as they purported it to be, but it also is where this conflict starts coming about, because now the English kings saying, okay, we have lands in northern France, we have lands now in England, we have a right to claim the French throne if we want because of that. Eventually, what the Normans would do was they would drop their Norman identity in large part and assimilate more into the English Anglo-Saxon culture. And today, I mean, most of it, England has obviously won out. English won out over the Norman French, but there are other aspects that have basically stayed since the Norman conquest that are not from their Anglo-Saxon origins. They're from the Norman conquest. So to give you some pictures here, a lot of these are from the Bayeux Tapestry, which is a tapestry that was commissioned to be made after the Battle of Hastings to kind of document in the Normans' way of documenting what the events that had led up to the Battle of Hastings and the Norman conquest. So right here we have, this is an image of Edward the Confessor. This is the last full Anglo-Saxon king before Harold Godwinson, the one that had promised the throne to multiple people, and then he ultimately, he died without a clear heir, and that's where the whole conflict starts. But this is him as depicted on that tapestry. And then here we have an image of William, the Duke of Normandy, who had become known as William the Conqueror or William the First of England. This is him, as depicted on the tapestry. This is particularly depicting the scene where in the Battle of Hastings that William was lifting his helmet up to show his troops that I'm still alive, I'm not dead. And then here we have a depiction kind of like the Norman mounted knights on the tapestry of them charging into battle. And that was one of the main benefits for the Normans, was they had mounted knights. They were not just charging on their own, they were running on the backs of horses, which made them an even greater threat to foot soldiers like those of the Anglo-Saxons. And then here is an image from the tapestry that actually depicts the death of King Harold Godwinson, where it seems to be depicting his death. At least according to legend, we said that it is said that Harold died by an arrow to the eye. And according to the tapestry, they even depict that there, where Harold is grabbing this arrow that has obviously gone to his head. And then here are some of the after things here. So this is a picture of the battlefield at Hastings. So this is taken more modern. It is absolutely modern day. The position of the photographer is about where the Normans would have been when this battle had started, and then the high ridge up here, where this abbey, the ruins of this abbey are, that is where the Anglo-Saxons and Harold would have been. The abbey was not there at the time. It is called Battle Abbey, and Battle Abbey was actually built by William after the Battle of Hastings years later, because the Pope said that you needed to make some kind of a repentance for how many people have died during your conquest of England. And what William did was decided, well, I'll build an abbey on the site of the Battle of Hastings, supposedly right on the very site where Harold had actually been killed, as kind of a repentance to the church for having done so. And it's the ruins today, it's not fully intact, but it's on the Hastings battlefield. And there is a stone with an inscription inside the abbey ruins that supposedly marks where Harold fell, where Harold ended up dying during the Battle of Hastings. And then here we have White Tower or White Castle. This is actually in the Tower of London. It's part of the Tower of London, but this particular tower in the Tower of London was actually built during William the Conqueror's reign, William the First reign, and it was built as one of those castle fortifications that he starts building in England to try to enforce Norman rule and keep, the populace under control and avoid any kind of a major breakout of hostility. So that, I think, kind of wraps up with this video. I mean, the Battle of Hastings, it's not, we could go much more in depth with more of the after effects, but then we're also drawing more into England in the Middle Ages, which I think we can get in plenty of in otherwise. And I'm even thinking at one point we could even go over, as I've done with the presidents, I've thought about at one point we could go over some of the English monarchs and how crazy some of them have been and how young others were. I mean, they had we think we've had some bad presidents. Well, at least we've never had a ruler that was 15 years old or even 2 years old, but England has. And I just think that might be something I might pursue in the future, but I don't know yet how that would look. Of course, we all know certain tales of like Henry VIII and his many wives and Bloody Mary and Richard the Lionheart, among others. But it's just something I thought about doing in the future, but I'm not sure we will. But that concludes for this week's video. So not the longest, but something I felt would be a nice little cover topic to hit on that's a little older and a little further back. So that, if anyone has any questions, any comments, any added information you want to do, be sure to leave that in the comment section below, and I'll feel more than happy to go through them. I actually got a couple this week that I did respond to that some of them were actually very informed comments, and I was actually very pleased to see that some people were engaging a little bit with the content, and that was very, very happy to see that. So next week, we'll be back for our last video for the month of August. At least I think it'll be our last one for the month of August. Let me double check our calendar real quick. Next week's a full week in August, but is the week following a week in August, is my question. Oh, okay, so next week is the last week of August. So yeah. So next week will be our last one for August. We will do our president's video next week. So that will be for this month. It will be William McKinley. So we'll go on to President 25 and finally enter the 20th century for once, who is also going to get assassinated. So that wraps up for this week. So hopefully everyone remains healthy. Everyone remains well. Everyone has, good fortune. And we'll see you all back here next week for the final video for the month.